Well, hello and welcome to a podcast series that we're entitling America Under Fire, The Old Guy Speaks. These videos grow out of a burden for younger folks who are busy working, raising a family, living their lives, and asking what's happening to America. What's happening is called Cultural Marxism, and many of those engaging in it aren't even aware that it's a strain of communist thought. The objective here is to provide a little info to help you understand some of what's happening. I'm going to use notes so as to stay a little disciplined and to not waste your time. I also need them because I'm 81 years old and I have brain fog and cognitive decline. I have the attention span of a second grader and my memory is shot, so I need the notes. One comfort that I have is that I believe Chuck Norris is 3 years older than I am, and he's still getting in the ring. So if Chuck Norris can get in the ring, I can too. I don't know how long this talk will be. We're going to break it into viewable segments that will vary in length. And I'll be interspersing squibs, what I'll call squibs, pieces of information stuck in here and there after writing out these notes in the spring of 2024. And I'll also mention books or other resources to help you with your own research. We're going to cover some sobering information to help you understand, but I also pledge to bring you hope after covering the sobering stuff. And I hope you'll stay with me through at least the 3 podcast segments on the US dollar, which will follow this introduction. I want to start things with a story. And so I suppose it should start with the words, once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a university professor, worked at a large university, and he taught subjects that required lab work, laboratory. And one day he was moving about in the lab, looking over people's shoulders and critiquing and helping and working with the students, when he noted one of his Eastern European exchange students was shifting uneasily on his lab stool and unable to get comfortable. So the prof went over and asked to help and asked him about it. The student told him that he still had a bullet in his back that was a bullet out of a socialist rifle in Eastern Europe. He had been with the resistance movement against socialism in Eastern Europe. That was his explanation. And he asked the prof whether the prof had ever learned did he know how to catch wild pigs? No? All right. Well, the student taught the professor how to catch wild pigs. You begin by picking an appropriate spot out in the forest, and you put a pile of corn on that spot. The wild pigs will find it. They will very warily come to visit. The braver ones will come first, and they'll nibble at it, and they'll go away. And if nothing happens, they'll become habituated to that. They'll gradually, more and more, learn that there appears to be no danger coming to the corn. So they'll start to come regularly to that corn. When that has happened, you build a fence. You put up a section of fence, pick a number, 60 feet long, say. You build a section of fence beside that pile of corn. The pigs will once again become wary at this new development. They may not visit the corn for a while, but the corn keeps getting resupplied every day, and the pigs will eventually come back, and they'll be back to full time there at the corn. When that happens, when they're comfortable with that first piece of fencing, you go to one end of the fencing, build another fence at a right angle, say another 60-foot fence. That will make the pigs wary once more. They'll stay away for a while, but eventually they'll become habituated to coming back to that corn because the corn was resupplied every day. When the pigs are habituated to that one, of course, you go to the other end, you build another 60-foot section of fence over here, and the pigs, of course, will be wary, but they'll come back and they'll be habituated to the corn once more. When that happens, you put in the final row of fencing to make a square. You have an enclosure with only a gate that opens into that enclosure. It may take the pigs a little while longer to learn to come through that gate, but they will, because the corn is resupplied regularly. When the pigs have become habituated to that, they'll usually come in the early dawn hours to do their feeding, and you keep resupplying the corn. When they come in some morning then, and they're eating on the corn, you close the gate. The pigs will panic and run about for some time, but they'll start to become used to that. There's no way out. They'll eventually give up on escaping, and you have captured and domesticated your wild pigs. That is the story of how Marxism works. We're going to go into what is called cultural Marxism by contrasting it first with classical Marxism. Classical Marxism is focused on organizing the workers of the world to rise up and bring socialism by way of a class-based economic revolution. It failed in America and in the West generally, where workers have done well enough economically that the traditional Marxist approach did not sway them. Let's turn now to the 1920s and 30s, the early 30s, in Frankfurt, Germany, where a university group calling themselves Freudian Marxists of the Frankfurt School saw that failure of classical Marxism coming. They argued that the need is to instead focus on cultural transformation, revolutionary changes in religion, governance, marriage, sexuality, the family. They said, look not to the factories and the farms, but rather to the university classroom as the home base for advancing socialism and communism. They spurned the church, and they looked to Marx and Freud as their gods. They set out to organize the students and the academy, the educational establishment, the media, the entertainment industry, all of the culture-forming institutions that could be dominated, including the church. Many of the Frankfurt School leaders were Jewish, so they had to leave Germany as Hitler rose to power in the early to mid-1930s. I think he came to power in 1933. They came to Columbia University here in New York City and spread from there. Antonio Gramsci, he was an Italian socialist of the time, called their subsequent efforts the Long March through the institutions. And that is what has happened to us. The long march of cultural Marxism through our culture-forming institutions. In the words of Professor Paul Kengor of Grove City College in Pennsylvania, instead of joining a factory collective or making bombs in basements, a leftist professor could help free society from capitalist exploitation by penning essays in his office or teaching students. They question everything, including moral absolutes and the entire Judeo-Christian basis of Western civilization. They frame seemingly benign conventions as systematic injustices to be remedied, and nothing was or is off limits to them. They fostered a dogma so critical that it would brand itself as critical theory, with many offshoots like queer theory, feminist theory, critical race theory, and so on. We now have entire collegiate departments of critical theory, social justice, and so on, in a never-ending search for the newest class of victims to be avenged. The goal of cultural Marxism is socialism, fascism, communism, collectivism overall. Collectivism is the overarching term. Collectivism in general. In order to progress, it must eliminate private property rights, religion, and the family unit. It requires that we yield up our individual rights and our individual identity to group identity. And that's a major point. It employs a fear-based centralization of power, and it eliminates the middle class, producing a society with a few elite masters and everyone else living in poverty. To give you a little background on it, there's a book I can recommend to you. A little bit of reading. This book would give you a bit of a flavor of what cultural Marxism might be looking for. This book, 1984, is by George Orwell. It's about a dystopian future sought by cultural Marxism. This would be a good book. There's another one I don't have with me, but it is a very similar type book with a slightly different perspective, and that is Aldous Huxley's book, his novel called Brave New World, from about the same time frame. So 1984 and Brave New World would be a couple of novels that deal with the dystopian future that is sought by Marxism. Let me mention a leading light of cultural Marxism, a guy named Saul Alinsky. He was a Chicago community organizer who was reportedly mentored by Frank Nitti of the Capone organization. He opposed things like capitalism, private property, individual rights, and he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals on how to weaken and destroy a society from within, how to advance radical goals while camouflaging them so as to appear to be working within the system. He dedicated his book to Lucifer, whom he called the first radical. He advocated saying and doing anything for power. His goal was to fundamentally transform the United States of America. He said he came not as a reformer, but rather as a destroyer. He and his book, Rules for Radicals, have had a great influence on way too many people in America. Squib. Here's your first squib. Squib. One of Alinsky's recommendations was to accuse your enemy of whatever it is you're doing. It creates confusion and distracts from the real culprit. If called to account, they can dilute the charge by saying everybody does it. Squib, a related squib, closely related. Cultural Marxists practice projection. They rationalize their destructive behavior by projecting it on to others. Let me give you a perfect example. Accusing others of misinformation and disinformation. a topic that we'll discuss later. Just a perfect example. So that's just a little bit of perspective on the topic of cultural Marxism. We'll dig down now in further segments. We have several segments on various aspects of it. So we'll take a break at this time and hope you come back and join us for segment 2, which will start our coverage of the US dollar. Thank you.